Hello, hello, everybody. We are so happy to see you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome. We're glad to see you. We'll give it another second for people to come in, and we'll make sure we are properly live streaming this event. Excellent. Well, I would say let's get started while more people are joining us. Very happy to be here today. My name is Diane Buis. I'm here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live number 7, our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of the Accelerator program that runs for 4 months, as an opportunity for the 104 companies across our 3 cohorts to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. For those joining us live on the live stream, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world. It's a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but for people with companies that are up and running, that have teams, that have prototypes, early evidence that the technology works, and then we partner them with experts in the industry, strategics and others, to help them bring their product as quickly and efficiently to the market as possible, and with as much value as possible. And so the US program has 61 companies in it at the moment, and we're opening up our webinars to the broader ecosystem than those 61 beyond the cohort. So if you're on that live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And for our cohort companies, you can make use of the Zoom Q&A function, and we will try to get to the questions in the Q&A session with our panelists after we stop the live stream. So panelists, please stay on at the end of the live stream so that we can do a little bit more Q&A. With all of that said, it is a real treat to have 2 very knowledgeable panelists from the FDA with us today. We're very excited to have you. We're very excited for the discussion. And I will give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Before I do that, though, I would like to, on your behalf and on our behalf, for all 3 of us, to make the disclaimer that, of course, both April Marone and Ed Margerison will not speak broadly on behalf of the agency to any specifics of your applications. So consider this broad advice, and for any specifics, you will, of course, have to speak to the people who are reviewing your applications. With that said, I would like to give April Marone an opportunity to introduce herself, and then I will give Ed Margerison an opportunity to introduce himself. Welcome to both of you. April, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work, please.
Sure. Thank you, Diane. And thank you to MedTech Innovator for inviting me to be here today. This is really exciting. So my name is April Marone, and I am currently an advisor with a CDRH new program called the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, or TAP. And I joined that program now. It's going to be almost a year ago. This program started in January of this year. Prior to becoming a TAP advisor, I've been with CDRH for almost a decade doing pre-market review, primarily in the obesity and hepatobiliary devices space. I'm a scientist by training. I have my degree in chemistry, and prior to joining the FDA, I did basic scientific research. And thank you again for allowing me to be here today.
Fantastic. Really appreciate you being here today. And we'll dive more into the TAP program in a little bit. But first, Ed Margerison, welcome. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are and your work?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. And again, thank you for the opportunity, as April said. I'm Ed Margerison. My job title is I'm the director of the Office of Science and Engineering Labs at CDRH. We're kind of the R&D arm for CDRH, and we also take part in around about 1/3 to 40% of pre-market applications as well. I was a million years ago a molecular biologist, but I've spent most of my career in industry, mostly orthopedics and sports medicine surgery. And I'd like to reassure everyone out there that I do have some empathy with them. I've been CEO of a startup up in Montreal in Quebec. So I feel your pain and some of the things you have to do to navigate the whole pre-market space. I've been with FDA about 6 years, as I've said. And I'll hand it back to you, Diane. We'll get into other specifics, I'm sure, as we go through.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. So I think let's kind of just start with some of the bigger trends we're seeing before we dive into specifics. Everybody is trying to keep abreast of the US regulatory environment. What have been some of the impact of outcomes, decisions, and approval times? I'd love to hear from both of you. What are some of the trends that you've been seeing?
If I can start, maybe. I think that it's a little difficult to say right now, and April's been more in the middle of this, but the last 3 or 4 years have been a bit crazy. And there's been many things in the press about the capacity and level of work we've been facing and things like that. But a couple of the trends that we're definitely seeing in terms of technology and things like that we're facing, we're seeing a lot more technology coming into us that was developed for other industries. I think augmented virtual reality is a great example of that. We're beginning to see devices that are beginning to think about having information flowing across 5G networks. So that's having quite an impact, because from my parts of the organization, as we get these technologies in, we need to make sure that they are appropriate for medical uses. It's one thing driving an augmented reality car around Monte Carlo, but if you're using that in an operating room, it's a very different situation. So we're seeing a lot of those things. And I'd just like to take my hat off in a public forum to our, as I call them, superhero reviewers, who over the last 4 years have been coping with the crazy amounts of work on top of the extra workload that the pandemic caused. And I think given that, the approval and clearance times have stayed remarkably consistent and pretty impressive, actually. April, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you. So I think coming out of our public health emergency, we've really had to be very adaptive during these last few years, and workload increased, and we needed to be able to respond even quicker than we have historically. So we're really taking opportunity of those lessons learned during the pandemic, and we're using that, such as starting up our new TAP program that I'll talk to you about shortly to make some of those lessons learned more impactful for what's going on now. We are fortunately seeing a lot of the innovation that was slowed down or stopped during the pandemic coming back. So we're seeing a lot more companies come in through the pre-submission program. We're seeing more IDE studies either getting back on track or being initiated. And, some of the things that we had to do to be adapted during the pandemic, such as more remote patient monitoring, are being able to be now implemented more regularly outside of a public health emergency. So I think we're seeing the general trend is we're back. So that's great to see that.
I appreciate that. And maybe I'll just stay with you, April, and have you tell us a little bit more about the TAP program. Could you elaborate on what it is, who it's for, and its current status?
Sure, I would love to. So TAP is a new program. It started with our MDUFA 5 time period, which we launched in January of this year. We were a little bit delayed. And we started this in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices. And we are expanding now at the new fiscal year on October 1 to our Office of Neurology and Physical Medicine Devices. So TAP is really targeting devices that have their breakthrough designation. And we want to get these devices that have the potential to really have a high public health impact into the hands of patients. So we want companies that are developing these devices to think a little bit larger than their regulatory strategy, but their overall business strategy. So not only how do I get through the FDA, but how do I address the needs of then those other stakeholders, such as payers, that are really important to reimbursement decisions, and also the users of the devices. So that's patients. What do patients want? What will patients accept and take advantage of? And then what do physicians want? And how can these devices fit into practice guidelines? How can they fit into clinical workflows? So through TAP, it's a voluntary program. If you meet the criteria and would like to be part of it, we really want to help you think about these kind of larger evidence collection needs and help you then integrate those needs into your strategy earlier on in device development with the overall goal of getting successful commercialization faster.
I really appreciate that introduction, and it's exciting to hear that the program is broadening. That's fantastic. Perhaps taking a step back and thinking a little bit more broadly about, how much and in which ways should a company communicate with the FDA? What are good ways? This, especially, I feel folks dialing from the online audience. Many of the medtech innovator companies have already engaged in very early ways, some in more advanced ways with the FDA. But how do early stage or mid stage companies engage with the FDA? How much, how often, how early should one reach out, and how?
Yeah, I don't think there's any one answer to that, Diane, but it's a really, really important one. I think the first, if we're thinking about direct interaction, first of all, rather than indirect, the obvious first step is some sort of Q-sub. Typically a pre-sub. I've been through them myself when I was kind of on the other side of the fence. And I always found those incredibly useful for a number of reasons, really. One is particularly pre-subs. From an FDA perspective, we want to provide help. We want to provide very much guidance on whether a development path is acceptable. That's all good stuff and obviously really important for companies, but it also opens up the dialogue, which I think is really at the heart of this question. Typically, and it doesn't work perfectly, of course, because people move around, but we try and keep review teams relatively constant through as devices are coming through the center. It isn't perfect, like I said, but you can start a dialogue at that point, because the days have long gone of CDRH, and I remember them well, of CDRH kind of setting exam questions, but you didn't really know what they were, so you didn't know how to answer them. Those days are long gone. It's a vital part of our mission now. We've publicly stated this, and Jeff, my boss, has stated this many, Dr. Shuren, sorry, has stated this many times, that innovation is part of what we do. We actually want to help that and get good products on the market for patients. That's what it's all about. So if I can just take another couple of seconds and say there's actually a lot more indirect ways of contacting us as well than people sometimes realize. We have an organization called DICE, the Division of Industry, Communication and Education. Nearly got that wrong. They're part of our Office of Communication and Education. Great group. They can act a little bit like a kind of a front of house. They're available by email and phone. You can get them easily on the website. There's also a module on the website I'd like to point out called CDRH Learn, which is actually really, really good. So there's a lot of other resources out there aside from just contacting us directly. But the kickoff of all those things really is some form of Q-sub and starting that interaction. And very much our culture now is to try and build interactive review as much as anything else.
Yes, and I would like to second all of those comments by Ed. And really the answer is you should communicate with us often, and you should communicate early. Interactive review is part of our culture. Interaction with all FDA stakeholders is part of our culture, and we really want to work with you to make sure that you're using your resources the best that you can. Specifically, anytime that you're about to use a lot of resources, that could be time or money, stop and think, maybe I should talk to the FDA to make sure before I do this, it's going to be consistent with what is going to meet their needs.
Yeah, and I think informational Q-subs are a really good way of doing that, actually. It introduces us to a technology or a product and introduces people, which is always very useful and things like that. And if I could just say one piece of advice for a lot of people, we actually get pre-market applications that don't really say what the device is and what it does, because if you're in a development team, you live with it 24/7. You know what the product is and what it does. And don't forget that the reviewers and some of our other colleagues they've never maybe seen it before. So stating the obvious and having very clear descriptions of what the device is actually is incredibly helpful for us. It sounds so simple, but without it, we can be going off at tangents.
I appreciate that direct advice to companies. And what it brings up is really, where is that line to getting feedback without perhaps getting through a full-on pre-sub meeting? So, because this is the type of feedback, you're not telling me what your device actually does, that is incredibly helpful, and it's helpful to have it early on rather than many months later. So, are there? I'd like to understand a little bit better. How does one get early stage, high level feedback without perhaps going through a full-on pre-sub meeting?
So that is a really good question, because it's always a bit of a balance of, what type of feedback are you looking for and how much detail do you need back from the FDA? So as Ed had mentioned, we do have DICE, which if you're kind of looking for higher level questions, they're a really good resource. And one of those questions may be, who regulates my device at the FDA? Because that would be the first thing to know is, and who can I send an email to and kind of ask some of these questions? And so if you know which division your device is going to, or even better yet, which team, don't be shy on emailing that director or that assistant director, maybe with some of your high level questions. You'd be surprised sometimes how much interaction we can do just from getting emails like that. With that being said, if you really want some feedback from FDA that you could probably, then use to actually move forward, you probably want that in some more formal format. And that's where the pre-submission program really adds value, is you're going to get that resource allocated to you. You're going to get a lead reviewer. You're going to get the experts that are needed to answer those questions. And that feedback is something that, unless, new information comes about that would make it change, it's going to be pretty, steady as to what FDA's responses are to your questions. We do have other mechanisms to interact a little bit faster. I know pre-sub, sometimes people are like, it takes a minute, and that is not inaccurate. But if you have breakthrough designation, you can take advantage of our sprint discussions, which offers a little bit more faster turnaround on topics. And of course, if you'd like to be in TAP, that is one of the focuses of TAP, is to get really rapid quality feedback and in a really interactive manner. So it's less formalized than our traditional pre-subs.
Yeah, and also for everyone, don't forget the guidance on feedback, which was actually reissued in June. Very recently. I would recommend everyone refreshes their memory on that. You can get it on the public website, but it actually goes through step by step what are the different Q-sub types, because this is not an exam, I think there are 4 types, and it says it lays out when they should be done, what the expectations are, what you should submit in writing beforehand. So that's actually a very well written guidance. And I think that's should be a great help, and that's been refreshed literally in the last couple of months.
I will admit to actually having looked at that this week, just in preparation for this call. So thank you. I can attest to that. I know that people will also be interested in understanding a little bit of timing. And I know that's a hard question, so you may not be able to give me a hard answer on it, but what's the approximate timeline for an initial pre-sub? Should it be preclinical testing, right after clinical testing? What does that look like?
I think it probably depends on what question you really need answered. I mean, a lot of pre-subs are to answer very specific questions. FDA is not going to tell you how to develop a device. That's not our job. That's the legal manufacturer's job to do that. So it very much depends what sort of feedback you want. The last one I did when I was CEO of the startup, apart from the fact it got bounced to CBER, which didn't make me happy, but it was very much at the time where we were just about to embark really on the more pivotal regulatory preclinical testing. That's the time that I chose to do it, because that was where we had to start committing a lot of dollars, and we didn't have a lot of dollars. So we were really looking for some confidence that we could tell our investors that we'd had a conversation with FDA and that our development pathway was considered acceptable at that point. The value of that to us at the time was huge, because we could then turn to our investors and say, we are on the right track, and then try and get them to write more checks. And that was what we were doing there, as well as getting the confirmation of our pathway. So I think it very much depends. Each situation is going to be a little different. I think it depends on where you really want a, because with a pre-sub, the answers are going to be documented. And there are official answers from FDA. It's an official discussion and all that good stuff. So where that's most useful to you, then do it. There's also that's a little bit different from the informational ones, where if something's very new, it might be, you might have a different question of, can I enter the breakthrough program with this device or something like that? So I'm going to go back to being a regulator rather than a industry person and say it depends.
That's fair, and I appreciate that. And April, I might kind of just slightly amend the question and say timelines for a response for getting into the TAP program. Are there approximations there? That said, if you have a different answer on the timelines for pre-sub, I'd like to hear that too.
Sure. So I would like to just echo a little bit about what Ed said. So really, anytime you interact with the FDA, if you have specific actionable questions, that's the type of questions you should be asking. So don't ask us broad questions like, do you agree with my plan? Do you think this is a good idea? Will this result in a positive regulatory decision? Really ask the questions that we can answer specifically, because you're going to get back kind of what you put in when it comes to the, the level of detail in those questions. So with the pre-submission program, there are MDUFA timelines associated with that. So we are committed to 90% of the time giving you a response within 70 days, which is not a bad timeline, but sometimes that can be a little bit challenging if you're trying to actively and dynamically modify things. So if you're having to ask FDA a question, wait 70 days, modify something, ask, okay, how about this, 70 days? So that can be a little bit of challenge whenever you're in the groove of going. So that's one of the reasons why when we offer sprint discussions through the Breakthrough Device Program and why we have TAP. So TAP timelines are also mandated now by MDUFA 5. So we, starting next fiscal year for TAP devices, you can request several types of feedback, but we're committed 90% of the time to have teleconferences when requested within 14 days. So that's a very rapid turnaround that gets your FDA team in a discussion with you to really, shoot ideas around and kind of figure out what may work for your company and your strategy at the time. We also are offering written feedback to specific questions. If it's biocompatibility or sterility related, that's within 21 days. And then for other topics other than those two, we're offering feedback within 40 days. And then in addition with TAP, you can make requests to have FDA facilitate engagement with non-FDA stakeholders. So we do not have timelines associated with those because some of those stakeholders are, they're not FDA people, so we can't commit them to doing things in certain times, but you do get the added benefit, if you will, of being able to engage with other people such as payment subject matter experts or professional societies or patient organizations that have pre-agreed to work with FDA through our TAP program.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. And you just mentioned payers. And so that actually brings up a question that we've discussed internally, specifically during our value workshop with the MedTech Innovator cohort companies. And that is, there is an early payer feedback program, EPFP. And so I'd like to just get your view on what type of company most benefits from engaging in that program. And I recognize that that is not like in the core of your purview. If you have any comments on it, I'd love to hear them.
Sure, so I can comment on that. So really, so the question is who would benefit from participating in the early payer feedback program? So I think anybody who would like to get input back from payers, which that can be private payers, and CMS is also a participant in that program, would benefit from participating in that early payer feedback program. Again, it's something where you should be coming with your strategy for here's how you see reimbursement potentially working for your device. And through that program, you can then solicit conversations with payers that have pre-agreed to work with FDA through that program. However, it is voluntary on their part. So if they maybe, they could just be busy, but maybe you're not providing the information that they would like to see, they may not then reciprocate and ask to engage. But it's a great program, and I'm not sure who would not benefit from getting some feedback from the payers a little bit in advance.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add very briefly is I would advise companies to know if their product is going to be predominantly CMS or private pay going into that sort of program, because in all the products I put out on the market for the large companies I worked for, there was only one that was CMS, because I was more in the sports medicine arena. That was all private pay, because most of the patients, our average age was 36, so it's a very different situation. So kind of just be aware of that going into a program like that, I think.
That's helpful. Thank you. You know, as we're talking about tactics and what's useful to whom, there's an early feasibility study initiative. Is that something that that folks should engage in, and who should engage in that?
So our early feasibility study initiative, that's, well, it depends on if that's going to fit your needs. So that program was created to allow for companies to come in and get investigational device exemptions approved for devices that are not at their final design phase yet. But however, they've really reached the limit of what they can do with preclinical testing. So it's a little bit of a different paradigm. You're not evaluating the device for so much effectiveness, but more for the design of the device. And you will more than likely end up tweaking that design after those studies. So you still need to minimize risk to patients as much as possible to have those studies be approved by the FDA, but you do not need to be at a final device design stage.
And again, the guidance is really helpful on this one. Actually, it's another very, very clear guidance that I'd recommend everyone look at. Only one caveat on that, the guidance on that is quite old. All the principles still apply. There is a more recent one if you're developing a device that's got, I think it's in the area of type 2 diabetes. So just a little warning on that. I know navigating guidances can be an area that can be complex, but there is a very good guidance on the early feasibility program and what's expected. And as April said, if you're not going to get any more preclinical data, how can you actually keep your development project going? It's very clear on that.
Yes. So just to kind of speak to that, so that guidance was my effort. So we did put out a final guidance on it.
Well, I said it was good, huh?
For glycemic control in patients with type 2 diabetes for feasibility and early feasibility studies. And that's really a successful story because we were getting a lot of innovation in that space. And instead of just having pre-sub conversation after pre-sub, we said, why don't we just put all of this into a guidance? And so we did. So if you're developing that technology, I strongly suggest that you look at that. But that is one space where early feasibility studies are applicable because some of the devices, they do not have really an animal model that they can test out some of the device treatment parameters. So they do need to move into humans to be able to test that out.
Excellent. We got a question in from LinkedIn. David on LinkedIn asked, if a company is considering third-party approval process, should they still engage with the FDA on Q-sub or pre-sub meetings? Basically, if they're going through a third-party approval process, is it still worth their time? Is it worth the FDA's time to have separate conversations?
April, do you want to take that one?
I can try. So I'm here. In my space, we haven't seen a lot of use of the third-party review program, but you know, it's essentially where we've agreed that other parties can review your application, and then we review their review of your application. And you know, we're still going to be holding you to the same standards to meet the regulatory requirements that we would if you weren't going through that third-party reviewer. So if you do have areas that you would benefit from getting FDA input, then you definitely should come and talk to the FDA. I would not just rely on your third-party reviewer to handle that. With that being said, I think we're normally accepting those types of reviews in pretty well-established device areas. But if you're innovating and maybe you're making enough of a change where you have a question, then that would be definitely valuable to speak to the agency.
And that tees up in many ways a question that we often quietly get from companies, and that is, should you work with consultants? When should you work with consultants? Should you bring your regulatory function in-house, or should you outsource it? And there as well, I understand that you cannot prescribe, but I'd be curious to hear your response as to in-house versus third party, or outside consultants?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. To some extent, it's going to depend on the depth of your pockets as well and what stage you're at. Now, given that this is MedTech Innovator and all the great companies that come through that, they are a little bit later stage. If you're very early stage and you're a professor with a patent, as we sometimes say, then you're probably not going to bring that in-house. But I think it's another technical function. It's obviously a pivotal one, as is product design and all those other things. We're not going to prescribe what should be done. We know there are some very, very good regulatory consultants out there, and we know many of them because they're very often the face of the company when they come and talk to us. I think it really, for me, it comes down to the quality of advice you're getting. And if I could share one little story about one of my previous jobs, where the company I ran was kind of a conglomerate of a number of small companies under one umbrella. All of the others were pharmaceutical companies. We had in-house regulatory support. Unfortunately, it was very much the expertise was all towards pharmaceuticals. And as we all know in this space, life's different in devices. But it was then very difficult really for me to get good device regulatory expertise at the time. So it's kind of horses for courses, as we would say in England. It's you've got to, there's so many different technical aspects that go into the development of a good product. You got to take the best advice wherever you can get it. But for me, if it was a very, very early company with very early stage, really more in an R stage than a D stage, that may be a little early, but to bring it in-house anyway, but you still need to know where your goalposts are at the end of the day.
Excellent.
Yeah, I guess I have just one comment to add to that. So I have been told by more than one fairly small companies that they have spoken to regulatory consultants that tell them, do not speak to the FDA, just go in with that marketing submission. And if you hear your consultant telling you that, I would say think twice a little bit about that, because you definitely want to be speaking to the FDA about what your plans are and getting agreement on that.
Yeah, that would be very old-fashioned advice, I think, wouldn't it?
I've heard it very recently, but so somebody out there is still saying it. If you find that person, beware.
I think the other angle to it as well, Diane, is there's also a split between, if you do have a consultant, and as I said, there's a lot of very, very good consultants out there, but do you want to be paying hundreds of dollars an hour for them to type up documents? So you've got to be a bit canny about what part of that you're outsourcing as well. There's true consultancy, there's admin work and things like that. So I think every company's got to make a very informed choice about which part of it they're going to outsource as well, if they're going to outsource.
Absolutely. And I will add, we have the privilege of working with some truly outstanding consultants who are helping our companies a great deal. But I didn't want to just not ask the question just because we work with great ones. So one of the questions I got from one of the companies was, apart from an increased filing fee, what other differences are there between a 510K requiring clinical data and a de novo application? And how do you determine which one you should go for? I'd be interested to hear your view on those.
I'll take a quick go if that's all right, April, and if I get it wrong, you can correct me. I think we've got to go back to the basics of what the de novo program is for. It came into existence. Remember that the whole of device regulation is not really that old in a way, but at the time before the de novo pathway was there, the regulation said if it's novel, it's class 3. That's it, end of story. But actually, that's not really very helpful, because a lot of things probably could be lower risk than the traditional class 3. But if they don't have a predicate, or it's a new technology or things like that, they're in danger of getting lumped into class 3. So in many ways, it's kind of not a choice as such. It's really down to, if there's a pro code, then you're going to be where you are. If it's a pro code that's a class 3 pro code, you're going to be class 3. And there's no really going around that. But if there isn't a pro-code and it really is novel, then there's a set of questions that need to be addressed in general terms, which is it then eligible to be a de novo, or is it a breakthrough, or some of the other things as well? But I don't necessarily see it as just a straight choice between which path shall we go for, because it's pretty clear as to what should qualify as a de novo. April, do you want to add anything to that, or did I get it wrong?
You did not get anything wrong. I would like to add, I guess, a few statements. So, essentially, if you can work through that 510K flow chart, I mean, that's what we use as FDA staff. If you can be a 510K, if you can make it through that flow chart, and we agree that the way you've made it through that flow chart, then you're a 510K. If you can't, then you're likely a de novo. I mean, we're assuming we're talking about devices that can be classified into class 2. So that's general and special controls can mitigate the device risk. I think the key part of your question, Diane, is 510K requiring clinical data versus a de novo. And I do want to stress that if you are developing a technology that you're going to need clinical evidence to support your indication for use, the standard for the quality of that clinical evidence, so i.e. the size of the clinical study, the design of the clinical study, that's not going to be minimized just because you can fit through a 510K flowchart versus be a de novo. And I think that is a very common misconception by companies, is they think if we can fit us in, then we're not going to have to do as much to develop that evidence that supports the indication. And that is not accurate. So I do caution people not to get too hung up on that regulatory pathway. I'm really focused on what are we indicating the device for, and what is the data that's going to support that indication.
That's a helpful clarification. I would say along similar lines, but different pathways. We've got some questions from companies to really, one of the companies said how to approach the FDA to potentially get into a class 2 de novo pathway when other companies developing similar products have been put in the PMA pathway. The company obviously believes they have a better product, they have a better safety profile, but how, and perhaps I'll ask you first, April, how can one go about that? Is there a way to nudge towards one pathway over another?
Well, so the regulations at the end of the day, those are laws. So you can't really nudge your way outside of law. However, if your product really is, the risk of the device, so that's a combination of the technology and what you're indicating it for. If it really can be fit into a class 2 regulation, so that's one where general and special controls can mitigate that risk, and that's including the risk of potentially not being able to offer the treatment that you're indicated for, then you can go through the de novo pathway and have a new regulation created. But you're inherently then different than your PMA counterparts because you're safer, you have a different profile, you're able to have that risk mitigated through these other mechanisms, where that's really what PMA are, is that you can't write special controls to mitigate the risk. So if you believe that that's your case and you have an argument for that, I mean, that's something that's very valid to speak to your review teams about during the pre-submission program, or using the pre-submission program, or the breakthrough devices program, or TAP, any of the interactive pathways we have to talk to you.
Thank you for that. I'm not seeing a lot of questions coming in from LinkedIn or YouTube, but that is perfectly fine. We've got plenty of questions from our community. Is an IDE or an FDA clearance necessary in order to perform clinical testing with a prototype? So a prototype question. What would you say?
Well, the short answer is no, it's not. We don't regulate stuff outside the US, number one. So if you're doing a prototype or a clinical trial outside the US, good luck to you. If you're a class 3, then at some stage you will need to get us that evidence that is needed for a class 3 device. And back when I was in industry, we just used to call it the IDE PMA route. So in certain circumstances, at some stage, you will need to. Now, we're trying to get improved pathways so that we can more easily accept clinical data that comes, for example, from abroad, which isn't perfect right now, but it's very high up the agenda list of things that we would like to get achieved, because that isn't a perfect process right now for many reasons. It's pretty complex, as you would imagine. But the IDE essentially is our gateway to having things done in the US that are class 3. April, do you want to add anything onto that?
Sure. Thanks, Ed. I can add a few comments to this question. So an IDE and FDA clearance, those are two things. So I'll address the IDE portion. So broadly speaking, all clinical investigations of devices, regardless if they're in any kind of pre-development, prototype phase, or finalized in the US, must have an approved IDE or be exempt from the IDE regulation. So if your device, regardless of that state of development, is not authorized by the FDA, so it hasn't received clearance through a 510K or granted through a de novo, approved through a PMA, then you're probably not going to be exempt from the IDE regulations. And those are 21 CFR 812. And I know that's very dry information to share, but those regulations are written pretty straightforward. So please feel free to go look at those regulations for IDEs. However, you may not need an FDA approved IDE depending on what your device study is. So if it's a non-significant risk device study, which that's also defined in the regulations, then FDA may not need to approve that IDE in order for you to commence your study. Only your IRB will need to approve that. And your IRB approving it is essentially approving your IDE. However, if your device study is a significant risk study, then you will need an FDA-approved IDE to do that. And once the FDA makes a decision on the risk, a risk determination, then that decision's final. Your IRB cannot decide differently. And one of the pre-submission options is to request a study risk determination through the pre-submission program. But you can also email your review team. Our review staff, especially in their specific areas, they're very knowledgeable on this. They know what needs IDEs and what don't. So that can probably be a pretty straightforward answer unless you're doing something really, really novel, and then it may need to be a little bit more in depth.
You both, Ed, you brought up clinical data from outside the US. And so I wanted to follow up on that. Just because there's obviously different price tags associated to clinical studies in different parts of the world. To what extent is it possible to leverage non-US clinical data for regulatory submission? And what's your advice on outside of the US versus US data and feasibility trials prior to a PMA study? I'll probably ask you, April. Ed teed it up for us.
Who did you? Sorry, Diane. Did you?
Ed teed up the notion of non-US clinical data, but I'm asking April. My apologies for being unclear.
So the question is, how much can you leverage non-US clinical data?
Non-US clinical data, yes.
So you can, really, how you want to collect that, whether or not you want to do an OUS study first and then use that to support a US study, or start in the US first. That's really, decisions that, individuals should be making. However, we do accept OUS data to support larger studies in the US, and we can even use that data to support marketing submissions. We do, however, need to make sure that that data is of sufficient quality. So it does need to conform with good clinical practice, and depending specifically on where your study may have been done and by whom, you may need different levels of evidence that it has conformed with good clinical practice. I don't want to just defer you to guidance documents, but we have put out a fairly new guidance on that includes the good clinical practice guidelines. So I do suggest anybody trying to do OUS studies kind of look at that. And again, you can talk to your review teams. I would caution against doing pivotal studies, specifically all OUS, just because we do want to make sure that our devices are going to be safe and effective for a US patient population. And depending on what you're investigating, it may be challenging, or it's going to at least create another obstacle for you to overcome to show that your data is applicable to the US patient population.
I think it's one of the big decisions that many companies have to make about where is their first target market. And we have a strategic priority at CDRH that we want to have appropriate processes so that companies want to bring their device to the US either first or in parallel with the rest of the world. And the old paradigm that you go to Europe to get your marketing approval to generate revenue so that you can go through development in the US, I don't think holds anymore. It's certainly, I don't think it has done for a while. We're seeing an increasing number of companies who are coming to the US first or in parallel with Europe, Australasia, or Asia, which is fantastic to see. It's very, very good news for US patients, which is what we're here for.
Thank you for that. I'd like to take you a little bit towards software. We've been talking a lot about devices, but I think at the very outset at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned a lot of innovation in a variety of spaces, including software. So perhaps just starting broadly, when does software become regulated by the FDA?
I think very simply, when it's being used for a medical purpose as part of a hardware device. I think the official definition is something like that, but is it conducting a medical purpose? So if it is, for example, printing out radiology results, that is clearly not a piece of software that is performing a medical function. But if it's providing a diagnosis, there's a good flowchart on our on the website actually about that. If it's providing, for example, a diagnosis and giving very clear instructions to a physician about a pathway to follow, then that would certainly bring it in. That's clearly a medical function. There's a lot of nuances around this. It gets very complex very quickly. And one of the debates or discussions we've had a lot internally has been around, if a piece of software is, for example, making a diagnosis or making a decision, one of the key questions is whether the basis for that decision has already been well accepted by the medical community or published or whatever. Is it kind of standard practice, whatever that means, and the software is essentially regurgitating that, or is it more of a black box? And those are some of the key questions that need to be addressed. The digital health website has a really good flowchart on that, and to decide, for example, if decision support software and clinical decision software is a regulated device or not. Other than that, it's very difficult to answer, I think, in specific terms, Diane. April, anything else from you on that?
Yeah, this is a very exciting area. And I think, depending on who you talk to, you're probably going to get different answers on this one, because it is, it's confusing, which is, it's great, gets us thinking about it. But as Ed said, really, once you meet the definition of a device, you're going to fall under FDA's regulatory authority. So I think anybody in the med tech who's developing, software, digital health technologies, I probably wouldn't ask, am I regulated by the FDA? I'd probably ask more, to what extent does FDA want to have oversight of the product that I'm developing? Because, we've put out a guidance. It's the general wellness guidance. It's pretty old now, but we basically said, we're not going to spend time on a lot of things, even thinking about, is it a medical device? If you're low risk and you're not really making claims that you're treating or diagnosing, and you're not targeting a specific population, a patient with, diseases or conditions, then we're just not going to worry about it, right? So, that's kind of what you have to think about. What are my indications? Who is the population that I'm targeting? What, statements do I want to make on my advertising and my, website? And, what is the overall risk that this device may pose to patients? And that's really a good place to kind of start conversations.
I'd like to ask a quick follow-up question from LinkedIn. What if software is used to provide medical education to the patient?
This is not a definitive answer, but typically provision of information that is already publicly available would probably fall outside. And I would imagine that would be exempt, because we don't regulate textbooks. That's usually the analogy we try and go towards. Is it in a textbook? We're not going to regulate those. They're not medical devices, quite clearly. I don't know if that helps.
It does. appreciate that. That definitely clarifies it. Thank you.
That's
So,
not definitive answer though, you know.
and we're not holding you to it. We appreciate you for the conversation. We recognize that you're not giving binding regulatory advice to anyone on this webinar. The combination of software and hardware products is the intersection of the device and the software. Exciting area. What is the regulatory pathway for software that is associated with devices, specifically hardware implants?
So Ed, did you want to comment on that first?
Yeah, I think for me, the overarching thing to remember is that we regulate the whole device. We don't regulate, other than in certain situations, particular components. So we're really looking for, and the legal term, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows, is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. But that gets complicated quite quickly. We're seeing a really exciting explosion in these devices. And that's really good because we're seeing massive innovation and a lot of new things coming through. But it's one of those areas that's got a lot of different axes to it. So, for example, if the software there, is that an adaptive algorithm? Is it AI enabled? We're seeing things that are claiming AI that actually aren't AI, things like that. So the situation is also fluid around the globe. We're working very closely with IMDRF to try and move towards harmonization of some of that thought process, such as risk categorization and things like that. But essentially, even though we're seeing an explosion in these things, at the end of the day, we're regulating the whole device. What's the benefit to the patient and how does that compare with the risk? And that really is the bottom line, I think.
Yeah. So I can add to that probably a little bit. So yeah, the regulatory pathways, they are what they are. So depending on risk, you'd fall into what we have. We do not have different pathways right now that really would probably be best for some of the software that we're seeing. With that being said, I have seen companies kind of floating the ideas around is like, okay, I have a piece of hardware that is needed to then collect some physiological data, and then that data is run through software, and the software is really doing the business end of what I want. And do I have to come in and get, regulatory authorization for this as a whole, or can I separate this? Because my software may be able to be used with some other piece of hardware. So it's kind of a portability question. And how would that look like going through the FDA? Because once you remove this software, now this hardware is just collecting data. So what is the clinical benefit to that if we separate that away from the hardware? And how can we look at that from a regulatory perspective? So we don't have really, or I don't have today, good, solid answers to those types of questions. I think maybe that's where this question is coming from. But we get those questions a lot, and we engage with companies on those types of questions. So if you're, that question is applicable to you, back to the basic answer of every question here, feel free to come in and talk to your review teams about your regulatory strategy and get that, nailed down to where it's going to be best working for you and what you're trying to do.
Thank you for that. And time flies when you're having fun. We are coming close to the hour. And so I would just like to close with giving both of you an opportunity to either share some of the most common pitfalls that you see early and mid-stage companies make, or share any other advice that you want to make sure you get out there to the broader online audience before we bid them goodbye.
One particular bugbear of mine, which is not really a bugbear, that's unfair. A lot of what my guys are doing from the regulatory research side involves biocompatibility, chemical characterization, tox risk assessment, everyone's favorite topic. We're trying like crazy to simplify that, make it more transparent and more consistent. I wanted people to know that. But it's sort of allied to a piece of advice that the numbers I use, the average size of a 510K submission now is longer than the Lord of the Rings. And if one of our reviewers has got 9 of these on their desk, expecting them to find the pertinent information very quickly is essentially unlikely. I hope the days are gone where some of the company tactics, and I remember it, was to put everything in there, send it all to FDA because they'll find the bits they want. I think the exact opposite, I would like to think, is becoming more true. That's a two-way street. So if you've got hundreds of pages which are detailing analytical chemistry studies and identification of compounds and the subsequent toxic risk assessment, just as an example, help the reviewer, please, by giving a kind of an overview or a summary at the beginning that says this is what it is and where to find it, because they'll get there at some stage or other. So that's something I would implore people to do. And I think our reviewers would thank us if we can move the needle a little bit that way. It's a thankless task being a reviewer, it really is.
Yeah, I 100% agree that one, it's a thankless task, and two, that really well put together submissions are worth their weight in gold. I've actually written thank you notes to consultants and regulatory staff that put together really comprehensive submissions that we can all point to. Here's what it is that we need right now. We can see what it is. I guess my contribution to this question would be that what I would like for the small and mid-sized companies to think about is what are those complete evidence needs across the entire device development pathway, and that's beyond your regulatory requirements and through to commercialization. Be aware that those needs to address others than FDA may be different, probably are going to be different, and that you can start to meet those needs early in the process without really impacting the time it takes to get your FDA authorization. And we are more than happy to work with you to making studies more robust to meet all stakeholder needs.
That is wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. I would, as a last, I'm going to say technicality, how do you want people who are following this conversation on LinkedIn or YouTube or watching it later to approach your offices? There are always people with more questions. Is the website the right way to go? How to best approach your offices with questions?
So we do actually have a TAP mailbox. It's the TPLC advisories program at fda.hhs.gov. It's on our website, in case I maybe said that incorrectly. But you can also contact me directly. I have no problems having people direct questions to me. And if I can't answer them, I can definitely find the right person who can.
And ditto for me, quite happy to do that. I think pretty much everybody at CDRH is very happy to be contacted by folks, and we can at least send the question to the right place. I'd encourage people to use the resources that are on the website and publicly available already, and certainly DICE are a very good entry point as well initially.
Fantastic. With that, I really want to thank both of you, and tell folks who are watching us on the live stream to come back next week when we're talking with payers. With that, we'll bid our LinkedIn and YouTube audience goodbye. Speakers, please stay on. We're excited about Q&A.